Welcome to Cyber Frontier, bringing you the latest news, trends, and hottest topics that focus on advances in cybersecurity and cyber industry economics. Our expert yet down-to-earth hosts make cybersecurity straightforward. They ask the tough questions and make this challenging topic something that everyone can understand. Our candid approach lets guests open up on topics we would all like to see addressed. You can find us on the web at newcyberfrontier.com. That's www.newcyberfrontier.com. Now join today's host as he introduces the topic for today's new Cyber Frontier.
Welcome to today's episode of New Cyber Frontier. A special treat in the studio with me today, Ken Klispie, who is the Chief Strategy Officer at Marca Global. So Ken, welcome today. Thanks for joining in studio, actually.
Thank you, Christopher. Thank you for having me.
Sure, and you drove down from Golden, which is a good hour, 2 hours away.
It's not too bad today.
Not too bad?
Yeah.
You breezed right through? But it's always hit and miss, right?
It is. Weekends are terrible.
Weekends, yeah. Okay. You know, I've driven up there occasionally, and you have to go across Denver to get to Golden. It's one of those. And the traffic through Denver can be just straight through or an hour delay. So it's like you have to just plan and account for that.
Yeah.
And get wherever you're going early, or plan to, and hopefully you do, just to be able to suck up that extra commute time across Denver.
Yeah, there's no good way of getting from Golden to South Denver, that's for sure.
Yeah, I know. I go up there quite often. I visit NREL up there in Golden and some other things that partners that we have. So
That's my neighborhood.
yeah. So Marca Global, you do internet's image, right?
That's correct.
Privacy.
So we have product sets for privacy and internet reputation from the standpoint of managing a person's reputation or a business reputation, and that could be from the standpoint of nothing, no visibility, to not so great visibility that's out there on the internet. So, and you probably know, once something's on the internet, it's there and it's not coming off.
So you do like disaster recovery for people's image, or is it more of let's try to build the brand?
I would say that it's more post, if there has been some type of episode, as post-episodic. So especially the larger the name, the more likely it is that you're going to have a media footprint for some time after the episode. So I would describe it more as post-episodic, and really dealing with the results of some event. Or we also recommend really future-proofing your company, making sure that everything that should be out on the front door about your company, whether it's your community activities, your employee activities, what you're doing in the world, what your system of operation is, that you really take the time to craft that, put that out there on a public face. And it's not a set and forget kind of concept either. It's something that has to be continually fed, so that, as we like to say, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when some event's going to occur. The larger the company, the more likely it is that those events are going to occur. And it's just a matter of having enough out on the front door that it gives someone pause before they just maliciously, or maybe not maliciously, print a partial truth about a company.
So this is more from almost like a law firm legal representation? Is that where you come from at this?
No, we really look at it from the standpoint of trying to control the narrative for a company or an individual, to say, instead of letting the internet and all of the invisible faces that are the internet, through forums, through blogs, through whatever type of contributions there are, control your narrative, we take the approach of, you need to control your narrative. You need to be the one that is telling the world about who you are, what you're doing, and ensuring that that is the face of your company or the face of yourself or your brand.
So you deal more with companies or like politicians, individuals with high visibility? What's your key demographic?
Yeah, I'd say it's about 50-50 between businesses and what we'll say as personalities. So we have a number of individual personalities as well, that might be in the NFL, that might be New York Times bestsellers. Again, what we look at is the full spectrum of what's there and what's not there, and what's not there is just as important as what is there, to make sure that an individual has those areas covered. Same with a company. And a lot of people look at reputation as, hey, this is what Google ratings say about you, but there's a lot more to it, and there's a lot more that happens.
Let's take a break here from our sponsors. We'll be right back in a minute.
Cyber Resilience Institute helps build strong cyber communities designed to prevent members from attack. Like building a neighborhood watch, it takes coordination and a sharing community to protect our identities and valuables in the virtual world. Typically, we hear that organizations know they need to do something to protect their cyber assets, but don't know where to begin. Let Cyber Resilience Institute help your community create an action plan. Cyber Resilience Institute will build your community or business marketplace so that it is designed to support a collective cyber defense. Contact them for more information at cyberresilienceinstitute.org.
Welcome back to New Cyber Frontier. Talking today with Ken Klispie and about image online, which I'm just sitting here absorbing because I'm continuously out there with everything we do. And one thing I would say and ask maybe even where your experience is on this is we don't get much feedback. We get feedback from people, from clicks and who's engaging and numbers and everything, but there's not much opinion that comes back other than getting guests for the show and stuff like that. When somebody starts out having a negative thing or whatever come back at them, what is usually how's that usually progress?
Well, it could be just a simple one-time occurrence, and the best way to handle that is through some type of response to the individual, a measured response. Certainly something that's take the emotion out of it and really try to address the key concern or clarify the key concern that someone's raised, even when it's a negative, to understand from the standpoint of how you might be able to handle something better or do something better. But again, make that public. Don't hide it. Make sure that if someone is looking at your organization or your company or you as an individual, that what they're seeing is someone that is reasonable and quite capable of receiving criticism and turning that into a positive. So that's
being public with this is what the way it is, what I am.
Exactly. And there's obvious places where you can't do that when you're crossing legal lines. Those are obvious places where you'd probably want to be a little bit more discreet and handle that offline and not publicly. But from the standpoint, most things that occur online are typically someone that's disgruntled for some reason or another, and the easiest way to deal with that is to do that openly and honestly.
So is there a difference with, say, a client that you have that might totally deserve the blast they're getting from the fans and somebody that's just disgruntled trying to find something that's not really there?
There is definitely a difference. And again, it comes down to ownership. If there has been an incident where whether it's an owner or whether it's an employee or whether it's you individually and you are in the wrong, again, it comes down to you really need to take ownership of that and be ready to make a change. If you're not, it probably isn't the right strategy. If you're not willing to take that ownership, if you're not willing to move forward, then you might think differently about how you confront that publicly. But again, our advice to you would be to look at it always as own it and fix it.
Yeah. So how much of the truth is there in any press is good press? Even if it's bad, blasted out there, you get more numbers out of it. Like, Martha Stewart going to jail did nothing but make her brand go up.
Sure. It's I think that's probably true for some brands. But I think that our own personal experience and when we do our searches online and we're looking for a restaurant or we're looking for a coffee house and or whatever the business is, if we see poor ratings, if we see negative in the search results, if we've been told negative things from word of mouth, we tend to steer clear. And so I do think that there's potentially some truth to that, but for the most part, I think the word on the street is really the credibility factor, and really does either contribute to the success or failure of at least small to medium-sized businesses and their ability to survive.
So you think it's more of a thing for smaller and medium-sized than it is once you get to a certain size, it's any press, just get your brand out there.
Even then, between PR firms and crisis management firms, you still have, especially with larger firms, they already have a playbook in place to deal with, and those playbooks typically have a number of scenarios. So they have responses, how they would respond, who should be the front person to respond, and how quickly they should respond to those crises that occur in their companies.
Interesting. So if we try to relate this now to cybersecurity, privacy, what issues do you run into that you think, hey, this is something that somebody should know about or we should be prepared for? What advice do you give?
Well, the obviously the greatest one out there is the breach. The data breach is typically on the crisis management list for most companies. In fact, I haven't really run across any companies where that isn't on the list. And it is a requirement. It's a legal requirement to report a data breach. So what advice do we give? The advice is that it does happen. Again, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when for most companies. Some companies have been lucky not to have that occur. But I think we can look at companies that we all know very well that took 3, 4, 5, 6 months to come forward to the public to let them know that there has been a data breach, that their data is out there in the public, and that they are taking steps to remedy that. I think at a crisis management plan, it's a matter of saying it's not enough to come forward and say this is what occurred, but you actually have to have steps, remediation steps in place as well, so that you can, as quickly as possible, try and make your clients whole as much as you possibly can.
And is there a playbook for people that might not have that plan that they can just kind of download and say, hey, this is what we're going to do?
You know, I think it's different for each organization. So there's various compliance, or I should say there's various guidelines, I should say, like NIST for if you're in the taxation or tax world. There's other types of compliancy that you have to fall into as well. So I don't know if there's a one-size-fits-all. If there's those standards out there, such as PCI for credit card issues. There's HIPAA. So again, it comes down to what is the data breach, how much PII was lost, and then really having at least a partner organization that you might be able to put forward or pay for the remediation of that type of data.
Okay. So, and we're going to break here in a minute for hear from sponsors, but something I wanted to in listening to you, I represent companies, I represent individuals. Privacy is kind of on your plate as the biggest industry area. How do you feel about, where the current environment is going in cyber of, companies really have the right to individuals' data in the United States versus Europe and some of the privacy regulation like in California, where it's leaning more towards the consumer has the right to their information. Where do you see that? Where do you stand? Where do you see that heading in the future?
Yeah, I think tying back to the data breach issue, I think that the liabilities associated with owning data will, especially through things like GDPR and CCPA and the Nevada. Can't remember the name of that legislation, but I think that constriction is going to force companies to rethink the ownership of a private individual's data, and it'll likely get squirted out of those companies, and that liability be pushed back to the individual. The individual will then have some responsibility for sharing that data to the companies they want to share it with. So I would think that's where it's headed. I would think that it has to really move towards the individual owns that data. It has to be available in some form that is accessible by companies through some type of a keyed mechanism. And I currently, the current technologies that are out there, it seems that a blockchain, some type of a publicly accessible cryptography is going to be the way that's going to be accomplished.
That's a good stopping point. We'll come back and talk about that because we have a lot of footprint in that and a lot of interest in that area. We'll be right back.
Murray Security Services are your cybersecurity experts with decades of experience providing professional training services for our clients in various industries. We offer professional training and certification in areas of cybersecurity, safety, health, and environmental services at our academy. Our in-person and online training provides a collaborative environment where students can interact directly with instructors through live chats or in private classrooms. Visit murraysecurityservices.com for more information.
Welcome back to New Cyber Frontier. On today, talking to Ken Klispie, the Chief Strategy Officer with Marca Global, and talked before the break about privacy, individual citizens, kind of individual people having control over it, GDPR and other privacy regulation, forcing companies to push that management off to the owners, give them at least the right to have their information removed from the company by law, right to be forgotten, I think is how that's worded. And blockchain being a technology that can kind of support that, can we have a technology solution? So what have you done in that area? Just curious. I mean, we're deeply involved with it, but where do you see that heading and how?
Yeah, so from the standpoint of Marca Global, it's a technology that we have over the last year really been interested in, and we've been following some companies for obvious reasons, or maybe not so obvious reasons. If we take something as simple as LinkedIn, and that data that you accumulate over years and years and years is publicly available, but it's really owned by Microsoft through their acquisition. And there was another company called Doc.io that formed, I guess, maybe a couple of years ago. And again, the idea there was to replicate essentially what LinkedIn did, but place it on the blockchain. It's my understanding that's not really received the adoption, and that company has not really moved forward. But those types of efforts are early efforts to move a person to really, from the standpoint of identity and credentialing, through blockchain, where as a first step to say this is really who I am, and these individuals really do know who I am, and this is really my education level and the companies that I've worked for, and have that truly authenticated and guaranteed is a great first step. Mm-hmm. But there's so much more that each and every company owns from these individuals. From filing taxes, for example, to all their banking information, to their health information, and all of their consumer data that's spread likely across dozens and dozens of systems. All of that is really a great liability to corporations, and it's really a liability for the individual as well. When an individual loses their identity, or I shouldn't say loses, but is stolen, if they don't have some type of protection in place, they could spend quite a bit of time and dollars to try and recover financially from that, and they may never be able to recover fully from that. One of the interesting things is in the world we live in, the Social Security number is issued once, and really there's not really a replacement Social Security number. So once your Social Security number is out there, you're kind of stuck. And there's many, especially in the medical industry, if you filled out forms recently for seeing a doctor, you'll notice that you typically will write that Social Security number down 2 to 3 times when you're seeing a new physician. So, and those records are out there. And health records are probably one of the most at risk out there as well.
Yeah, and once it's out there, and kind of begs the question, is there such a thing as privacy? Most of us have been breached our information by more than one of these data releases over the last couple of years. So our information is out there from more than one source, and we can't even prove that, that was this breach that caused our information to be out there, because it could have been another part. So a company now, by the nature of, other people have been breached, that was them that did it, not us, And the game pointing now, because everybody's been breached, we won't say everybody, but, it feels like it. Now you can't prove who's to blame for it.
Right.
And how do we take control back? It's like the genie's out of the bottle.
Yeah, I think the legislative lever will eventually, and again, I don't, my crystal ball feels very much like probably in the next 2 to 5 years that there'll be additional legislative efforts to try and push companies back and require greater and greater, tighter and tighter controls on how they're able to move data around, to the point that companies will become so walled up they may not be able to able to effectively really handle customer data in a way that's useful to the customer or useful to the company.
So they might just quit, just like, we don't do that anymore.
Yeah, there's examples where the idea of consortiums, I'm going to go back to the blockchain, where consortiums are forming in order to share identity data. So there might be, for example, a DMV that shares identity data about you for the licenses that they've given you for driving. And that might be a proof to a bank when you're opening a bank account. So that's interesting, but again, it's just a consortium of companies now that are owning your data or having access to your data. And that still doesn't feel like that's the place that it needs to move to. It almost feels more like you need to be at the center of, or at least in control of, when someone is asking for your information, that you are authenticating or you're granting access to that.
Yeah.
So it could be a credit bureau that's making an inquiry, what's known as a soft pull, on you as an individual. You wouldn't even know that. So there's many marketing soft pulls that are occurring that are not initiated by you. And the list goes on as far as the access people are getting to your data. If you own a smartphone, 79% of the smartphones are location service enabled. And there are the providers of your cell service are reporting the location, date and location of you as you move about. And that's quite useful, by the way, in marketing.
And marketers can buy this. Who do they get it from?
There's third parties that rent that service, and you're able to do what's known as retrofencing. So you can look back 2 years and select individuals based upon where they've been, and you can also look at dwell time, what's known as when they enter and they exit a specific polygon. So you can extract mobile device IDs so that you're able to target marketing to them. Now, it's a great service, but again, this is another example of the cost of ownership of a smartphone device.
So you said great service, right? But to somebody this is being done to them, like me, right? I'm sitting here thinking, okay, some company just bought my information about where I've traveled for the last 2 years. Doesn't that seem like a violation in some way of my rights?
It does. But again, it comes with when you enable location services on your phone, that's what you are agreeing to. So from the standpoint, if I look at it put my marketing hat on, if you're a good marketer, you're looking at it and you're not owning the data as much as the data really never transfers to the marketing company, as you're using it to say, I want to deliver a service or an offer to someone because they visited this location. So I'm trying to push to them something that they may not be aware of. So it's really the idea around awareness. But again, as we move, as we look at GDPR, we look at CCPA, we look at these different privacy policies that are in place, it really does push it back to the individual. And it really comes back to, there's no doubt that in the next 2, 5, 7 years, that legislation will terminate that access. And unfortunately, that will, in some ways, and actually many ways, it'll be a disservice to the consumer, because the consumer needs a way to say, no, I do want to be marketed to, but I want to be marketed to on my terms. And it really comes down to, how do you do that? How do you, again, create that identity and allow a person to opt in and say, yes, I am interested in purchasing a stereo in the next 60 days, or I'm interested in appliances, or I'm interested in automotive or automobiles.
So maybe on a per instance, I'm searching something, and a pop-up says, would you like to be added to a list to say, we contact you about this item or this type of item?
Exactly.
And you get added.
Exactly.
On a per instance basis.
Absolutely.
And you might even say, here's a time selection.
Exactly. Expire it after a certain period of time. So, and it makes more sense for the consumer, and it makes more sense for the marketer. The marketer doesn't want to spend money on consumers that aren't interested, and they do recognize there's an annoyance factor. That's why you even begin to look at these types of data to say, I really don't want to send advertising to someone that has no use for my goods or services.
Mm-hmm. So, in terms of what our rights are, you said legislation. It almost seems like, before we started, I was telling you about our privacy for the people, and one of the things they focused on is, the Fourth Amendment says the right to privacy against government, mm-hmm. individual citizens, but it doesn't have there was no concept of companies or organizations that hold our data that aren't government back at that point, other than like lawyers, attorneys, where you had attorney-client privilege. But it's like now there's just no addressing for that at all in our culture. It seems like, and my take is that we need a constitutional amendment to include this third party and what the rights are of citizens and the responsibilities of third-party data holders.
And that makes complete sense. I look at it from a marketing perspective in one way, but I also look at it from every other component of data mm-hmm. that each of these individuals or each of these organizations are trying to solve for. Whether it's HIPAA and the blanket that is thrown over top of medical data is a good thing, but it's also a bad thing. Giving individuals the ability to opt in so that better outcomes can occur in the medical world by sharing their data, by being given the option to share their data, is something that would be very useful to the medical community. Mm-hmm. However, when a legislative action takes place that literally completely shuts that down, then there's potentially decades of unwinding or trying to find the right way to move that forward. Meanwhile, we're deprived. The medical community is deprived of that data.
I see that, and just thinking about that exact example, and in looking at blockchain, it's one of the things that groups that work for the state here are designing in is how to separate out the private information from what is public, so you can verify the private and then sell it. The owner has the right then to sell it to whoever they want to have it. And I've even used the example when I'm speaking sometimes that, in the future, instead of buying 10,000 medical records about one disease from Google, you got to pay 50 cents to 10,000 people to get their record. But then, how does that data, once it is put together, the rights and responsibilities, and when we're looking at maybe a constitutional amendment, the rights and responsibilities of data holders would have to kind of cascade to how, if they get it themselves, they're not just open to sell it to anybody.
Right.
What are the requirements for that dissemination of it and responsibility of, you bought the data set, you got the rights from users. Now, does that mean you can just give it to anybody? Which means you can have it breached and go public, and you have the rights to it, so you gave it to anybody and everybody. So that line of even aggregation confidentiality model of, how do we prove that you're the one that got this data set, and how far you're allowed to share it for what purposes? And that has to be, portrayed to the collectees, the people that provided the information at the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I come back to the technology necessary to do that, to give that to the person and know what's in their data set and know who they've granted the access to.
Doesn't exist.
The technology's there, but there's so many implementations out there today of blockchain type technology, and there is a number of states that are more forward leaning into defining how to utilize that technology without crossing the SEC guidelines of how do you utilize some type of a token technology and how. But again, everything that I've seen, and again, I'm certainly not as well trod as many people are in the blockchain world. It appears that the current movement is really towards companies and government exchanging information about individuals, but I'm still not seeing, at least in what's been portrayed through many presentations, the individual. I'm not seeing the individual in this mix.
You know what? And I would tell you that we've been running this Privacy for the People campaign, which is about getting funding, community source funding, from individuals to support this development, so it doesn't feature companies and the needs of and we're not getting the individuals engaging. So I think an awareness, first of all, of why does this matter, and I think the individuals out there just not picking up the torch. Why is that? Would be the first question.
I hate to say it this way, but is it potentially an apathy, or is it just that it hasn't been? If there's a convenience factor to the average individual, whether it's really simple to do a change of address, I'll use that as an example, because I can go on my mobile device and I can place my new address into my profile, which is automatically based upon the fact that I've allowed my credit card companies to access it, and I've allowed ADP to access that. So I've granted these keys to people to say, yes, when I change my address, I just do it in one place, and I don't need to go to the national change of address database any longer. If I do a do not call, because I'm tired of receiving these types of phone calls, instead of having to block these individually, if I just simply go the other direction and say, this is my address book, and they're allowed, and it gets pushed out to your service provider, and the rest is blocked until it's permissioned. Again, these are convenience factors that might flip the consumer in favor of it, and they're not even aware that really what they're doing is they're protecting themselves, because they're gaining a convenience out of it, but they're also gaining something that they may not fully appreciate.
So, and I think what I heard you say is that, they don't really care. until it's been adversely affecting them.
Yes.
And they're the ones on the chopping block.
Yes.
They don't really care.
Yes. Thank you. You clarified that quite well. That it is a matter of it hasn't happened, and therefore I'm not too concerned about it. It's something that happens to someone else. It doesn't happen to me.
And when I look at the Me Too generation, it's kind of the first stages of people being able to be filleted publicly without any justification. And that people not, just having their privacy or whatever, not controlling it, not caring, it's kind of the first part of, wait a minute, I care about this because I'm the one that's been thrown out under the bus.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no proof of burden on the people throwing me under the bus for it to happen.
Right.
But it's still a small population. And most of us don't know somebody personally that has been wrongfully accused. We just think that, everything we see out there is legitimate. And maybe turning that tide, or enough people standing up and saying, hey, the wrongful accusation is epic.
Yes.
Is it, though? Is it to that point, I guess, would be the question.
I think at least from what we see in what we do at Marca Global, I would say that it's not at an epidemic proportion. I think it really goes along with who you are and where you are and the power that you wield, potentially. So for the average individual, it's probably not an issue. As the more public you become, it becomes a much greater issue. And this doesn't just go to politicians. This can go to anyone that's inside of a company at a C-suite level, or in a boardroom perspective.
Or just those, what do they call them, internet stars, the YouTubers.
Absolutely.
And stuff that they can be thrown under the bus and their whole reputation lost just from one whatever. Doesn't
One
matter
comment.
whether it's valid or not.
One
It's just
comment. Yes.
Boom.
The more public they are and the more followed they are, yes.
And so it's such a small population that it's almost like the burden now becomes on those people to know, be trained how to maintain that in case of an adverse action.
Absolutely.
Than the adverse of just trying to train everybody.
Yes.
Something we'll never do.
And you could almost look at it as something a little more sophisticated than the typical press training you receive when you engage a PR agency, where they give you the typical ideas of how do you move yourself in and out of a difficult situation when you're dealing with the media, for example. Again, some of these things that occur, especially when we talk about social media, especially when we talk about any place where someone's responding directly to anyone that's following them or a group of people that are following them, oftentimes those comments are made and not well thought through. Probably one of the greatest things that you could do if you are responding and you are a public figure, or you do have a number of people that are seeing what you're publishing on the internet, would be to write it and delete it, and then come back and write it later, after you really have an opportunity to think through who will see what you're going to say, because it will stay on the internet. It's not going to go away.
So before you go negative, let's think.
Right.
That's basically what you're saying.
Exactly.
Don't
write it,
blow
delete
up
it.
publicly. Let's write it, sleep that night, and see whether we still feel that way in the morning.
Exactly. I think it was President Eisenhower used to write letters and put them in a drawer that he would never send. So it's not an email.
I know that feeling. I have several things that I've written that have never been posted, and I've even let somebody that was working for me run with one that was a little negative before, and I've seen the cause and effectual of what happens when it, and it is, it's something that definitely it's a learning experience for people who are out there.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I'll give you a couple minutes. How would people engage you, say if they had it, and who might look for your services? and whatnot. So go ahead and give our listeners, how to get a hold of you and what do you do.
Sure. So Marca Global has a number of capabilities. One is there was a company that was acquired by Marca Global in 2015 called Internet Reputation. That's really focused more on the individual. And then there's Reputation Sciences, which is really focused on businesses because they are quite different. Individuals don't have some of the footprint that a business will have. And essentially what we really tell people or businesses, if you have anything from no visibility, and when we talk about reputation, we think in terms of your brand is what you say you are, reputation is what everyone else says you are. If you have no visibility on the internet, you have no reputation, which can be just as bad as having a poor reputation. The second part is if you've been in business for 10, 15, 20 years, there is no doubt that you have some negatives out there. And the question is, how impactful are they to you? And what is the strategy for fixing that? That's where we come in and we help. We really can do things such as we've had businesses that have never paid attention to what's known as net promoter scores. They've never really implemented any type of a feedback loop. They've never really put into place the idea of asking customers to review them. Simple things. They've really never engaged the media to tell their story about how they engage the community, the things their employees do. They've really not created a consistent social presence, whether that's on LinkedIn, whether that's on Facebook, whether that's on Twitter. Again, any of these social platforms, it really is an opportunity to tell your story, tell the people that are watching who you are, what you're about, what you do. And it's not as much about the products and services you offer, which is important for your business. It's just as important to let anyone that's looking know a little bit more about who you are. There's places on the internet that some companies don't think about, such as Glassdoor. And for instance, if you're hiring an agency, or if you're hiring some type of service that has a larger company, that will likely show up in the results. So again, that's a big part of what we do, is doing what we call a 360-degree audit. We really assess what's out there, whether it's your board members, your C-suite, your employees, whether it's a prospective employer, whether it's a prospective investor. These are the different ways they're going to look for you. This is the different type of information they're going to reveal about you, and this is the prescription for providing a remedy.
Interesting. So helping you build that positively. And how would they contact you? Give us your website.
Sure. So it's Marca, M-A-R-C-A, Global, LLC.com. So
Marca Global LLC.com.
And that is the holding brand. That is the company that really holds Internet Reputation and Reputation Sciences. We have a third product called InfoSweep. InfoSweep is really about eliminating your information off the internet. So there's a number of places that do what's known as data aggregation. So when you fill out anything from a warranty card, or you fill out some type of a fill-in form, getting back to privacy, your data's sold, it typically shows up on a number of sites where you'll search your name and you'll wonder why your information about your age, your telephone number, your email address, where you live shows up on these sites, and it's sold in many different ways. That is another service. InfoSweep basically goes through the process of removing you from all of those sites so that your data is not available. There is the ability to request that to be removed.
Interesting. And that is a service I've heard many people talk about they might be interested in right there. So, all right, well, thanks for joining today, and Ken, and we'll definitely, it's been a pleasure to have you on, and in the studio, we'd like to have some face-to-faces.
Thank you, Christopher. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to New Cyber Frontier. Remember to follow or like our post and circulate each new show to your networks. We keep you informed, bring you the latest news, explore new trends, and find the hottest topics. With New Cyber Frontier, you don't have to be a computer or cybersecurity expert. Just get plugged in. We encourage you to get involved. Tell us what topics interest you and join our mailing lists. You can find us on the web at www.newcyberfrontier.com. That's newcyberfrontier.com. Check out our previous interviews and please let us know if there are any topics that you would like to hear discussed. See you next time on New Cyber Frontier.